So for example, if I wanted a WhatsApp message to be sent to somebody at a certain point in one app, I can tap a button, it'll open up WhatsApp and say pre-populate the message that I should be sending maybe to the client or somebody else. And then finally, the entire set of data, usage data that's occurring throughout the workflow can be written to analytics, which can be useful for further analysis and optimization of the workflow, and also to help you to analyze where people are getting stuck, maybe where people spend a lot of time in the workflow versus other stages of the workflow where they're spending less time or it's getting less usage. So I mentioned at the beginning we were going to talk a little bit about how Fliplet compares. So you've heard quite a lot about what Fliplet's capabilities are, and I've listed them on the left-hand side of this chart. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about how Fliplet compares to other tools that you might be utilizing already for workflow or considering for workflow. So let's start with workflow tools such as K2, Brighter, Neoda, etc. Now, I just want to be clear, this isn't an extensive set of analysis. It's just high level to point out where Fliplet kind of fits in the mix. And of course, your experience may be different, and it probably depends on your level of knowledge and obviously what your colleagues' preferences are when producing workflow apps as well. But if you're comparing Fliplet to K2, Brighter, Neoda, etc., their benefits are that they are typically no code or low code. They're predominantly focused on no code. They have limited design capabilities, whereas Fliplet has extensive design capabilities. They're typically web only. They don't produce native apps, which means you don't get a lot of those native app capabilities that I've mentioned throughout this presentation. Their feature set is limited to what they generally offer, again, because they're primarily focused around being no code or low code. They're limited extensibility. In some scenarios, you cannot extend these tools with code. So you're stuck with whatever the standard feature set is. But one of the benefits of having limited extensibility is they have a low maintenance cost and a low maintenance risk. So moving on to app builders, common app builders are Power Apps, Mendix, Xamarin, with Xamarin and Power Apps both being Microsoft products. These tools are intended to be low code. They may require designers. Because they're low code, you also will typically need somebody who's quite technical, at least to be able to learn them. They do generally produce mobile and web apps, but some of them have limited distribution capabilities. So for example, in some of these tools, you can produce apps that can be distributed on standalone app stores, but sometimes the only way to access the app on mobile is through a viewer app. Because these are low code or designed to be extended by technical people, they are highly extensible. And with that extensibility comes a medium maintenance cost and a medium maintenance risk. So what I mean by medium maintenance cost and risk is if something goes wrong, the amount of time required is likely to be higher than with the previous set of tools that I mentioned. And then finally, you've got custom code. So this suggests that you're just hiring a developer or you're using your in-house development team and they're writing a .NET application or they're writing an iOS or Android app. And so this definitely requires developers and designers. It's the slowest out of the bunch because the code has to be written from scratch. Testing has to be very exact and very low level. Typically, if you're using these, you're only producing for a single platform, so you don't get your app to run across web and mobile. You would typically have to produce multiple versions of your app if you wanted it across multiple platforms. The benefit is they're highly extensible. They're the most extensible solution because your developer can literally do anything they want. But because of this very low level control, it also means that the maintenance cost and the risk is at its highest. So what we generally find with Fliplet, now just to kind of compare us, Fliplet is a no-code, low-code tool. We're highly extensible on design. We do produce native apps on iOS and Android, and we let you distribute them anywhere you want. We also support web apps on mobile and desktop, as I've mentioned. We offer enterprise-grade security with flexible encryption. Our licensing model compared to some of these other tools is quite simple. Fliplet app supports offline and online. And I just want to make a note that particularly when you're using workflow apps, you may not necessarily want a part of the workflow to be able to be done offline because it's really important that the data gets up to the server and maybe sent to the next user in the workflow. So you can toggle that feature on and off. It's generally easy to integrate Fliplet with existing systems such as APIs and databases. And because Fliplet is providing a lot of these capabilities out of the box, we take care of a lot of the maintenance and therefore the risk. So generally customers have low maintenance costs and low maintenance risk. So let's move on to some case studies now. So firstly, I'm going to talk about a customer who produced a fleet management app. And the reason why I picked fleet management app is because it's a fairly easy workflow for us to understand. It's kind of fleet management is related to mileage, vehicle inspections, things like this. And I think most of us have done a mileage claim at one point in our career. This organization in particular had 800 vehicles in their fleet. And so you can imagine that the fleet management team is quite busy trying to stay on top of all of their vehicles, not only the state of their vehicles, like were any damaged, but also what needed to be done to those vehicles, such as servicing, MOT, is the lease coming up to expire soon and it's going to be replaced, etc. So this app had a login. As a byproduct of logging in, the workflow app would then load the previous mileage data automatically into the app to make it a lot easier for a user to switch vehicles. And it would also pre-populate all of the vehicle settings. So that's an example of data being enriched. Then the user can capture mileage data as they use the vehicle. Now, we did our best to optimize the user interface and validation to reduce the amount of time somebody spent entering mileage data. So this would automatically recall the last mileage entry and put that into the from mileage field. And it would also do its best to use GPS data to kind of attach the latitude and longitude or GPS information to any mileage claims. Just in case there were any discrepancies, we could fall back to the GPS data to kind of say, oh yes, all right, so you're right. You did do a typo when you put that mileage in. You definitely traveled over 20 miles that day. We can tell by the GPS coordinates. You would also be able to collect vehicle condition information. So this meant that the fleet managers didn't have to kind of travel to all of the different sites and constantly look at the vehicles to ensure that every vehicle was still in a safe condition. And if issues were reported, those were automatically escalated up to the fleet manager, and the fleet manager was user type. Any data submissions were online only. There was no point the app telling the user, I've successfully submitted your data if it actually had cached it locally and was waiting to submit it to a later point in time. Because in this case, they might immediately submit the data and go and get into a new vehicle. And so we needed the fleet managers to have up to the second correct data. So submission was restricted to be online only. And then finally, the fleet management team had a set of reports. So they had dashboards with charts, metrics, and filtering, so they could kind of drill into the state of the fleet. But also they had compliance reporting, notifying them of when leases were expiring, when MOT or other critical services were required. So that's the fleet mileage workflow app. Now let me tell you about a kind of a new workflow that we're building into